The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Silver Creek, Colorado, as Gideon Tanner's bullet found its mark in the chest of the last man who'd ever call him Yellow. The year was 1879, and as the body hit the dirt with a thud that seemed to shake the very ground, the townsfolk whispered among themselves that the infamous gunslinger had finally gone too far. Standing there, his face an expressionless mask beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, Gideon holstered his Colt .45 with the same mechanical precision he'd employed for everything since returning from the war. "He's got nothing left in him," someone murmured as he strode past. "Eyes like a dead man, too broken inside to feel anything anymore." Gideon didn't bother responding. What was the point? They weren't wrong. The war between the states had hollowed him out years ago, and the decades since, spent drifting from town to town with a gun for hire, had scraped away whatever humanity might have remained. 34 years old, and he felt ancient, a walking ghost who happened to still cast a shadow. The saloon doors swung open as he pushed through, the piano player faltering mid-note before continuing more softly. The usual midday crowd parted like water around a stone as he made his way to the bar. The bartender, a bulky man with a waxed mustache, slid a whiskey toward him without being asked. "Sheriff's gonna want words about what happened out there," the bartender said quietly. Gideon downed the amber liquid in one swallow. "Man drew first. Always seem to around you." The bartender moved away to serve another customer, leaving Gideon alone with his thoughts such as they were. Simple, practical considerations about whether to ride out or face the sheriff's questions. No grief for taking a life. No satisfaction in his victory. Just calculations. The batwing doors creaked again, and a hush fell over the room. Gideon didn't turn, but he caught the reflection in the bar mirror. Sheriff Miller, looking more weary than angry. "Tanner," the lawman said, approaching slowly. "We need to talk about what happened." Gideon turned, facing the man squarely. "Self-defense." Sheriff Miller sighed. "3 witnesses say Barton drew first, so I ain't arresting you." "But that's the 4th man you've put down since riding into Silver Creek 2 months ago. Wasn't looking for trouble." "Maybe not, but it finds you just the same." The sheriff leaned in closer. "Town council's meeting tonight. Reckon they'll be asking you to move on." Gideon gave a barely perceptible nod. It was always the same. Do the dirty work nobody else would, then get pushed along when folks got nervous. He'd expected nothing different. "One more thing," Miller added. "Stage is coming in tomorrow from Denver. My sister-in-law's aboard. Schoolteacher, heading to take up a position over in Rimrock." He paused. "Road between here, and there's been plagued by the Silas gang. I'd hire you proper to escort her, but council won't approve the funds." Gideon stared at him. "Asking me to leave town, then asking for a favor?" Miller had the decency to look embarrassed. "I'm asking as a man, not a sheriff. She's family. Pay won't be much, but it would be a sight better than riding out with empty pockets." After a moment's consideration, Gideon nodded once. "I'll be at the stage depot at noon." "Thank you." Miller hesitated. "And Tanner? Try not to kill anyone between now and then." Gideon didn't dignify that with a response. He paid for his whiskey and headed up to his rented room above the saloon. It was sparse and narrow bed, washstand, and a chair by the window. He'd never been one for possessions. Everything he owned fit in his saddlebags. He sat by the window, cleaning his revolver with methodical care as the sun sank toward the mountains. Outside, the town went about its business. Women shopping, children playing, men talking politics on the boardwalk. Normal lives. Something he'd stopped believing he could have long ago. The next day dawned clear and cold, the kind of autumn morning that hinted at the winter to come. Gideon settled his affairs, packed his few belongings, and led his horse, a sturdy black gelding named Shade, to the stage depot. He arrived early, but the stage was late, which was no surprise. The mountain passes could be treacherous even in good weather. It was past 1 when the stagecoach finally rattled into town, caked with dust and looking worse for wear. The driver pulled the team to a halt, jumping down to open the door for his passengers. First came an elderly couple, then a traveling salesman, and finally, a woman in a plain blue traveling dress. Gideon's first impression was that she looked too delicate for frontier life. Slender and of medium height, with chestnut hair pulled back in a simple style, She moved with a grace that seemed out of place in the dusty street. The sheriff hurried forward to greet her. "Patience, thank the Lord you made it safely. Uncle James." She smiled, revealing a dimple in her right cheek. "The journey was longer than I expected. Roads are rough this time of year." Miller turned toward Gideon, who stood a few paces back. "This here's Gideon Tanner. He'll be escorting you to Rimrock." Patience Aldridge turned toward him, her hazel eyes assessing him coolly. There was no fear in her gaze, which surprised him. Most women took one look at his scarred face and cold eyes and found somewhere else to be. "Mr. Tanner." She nodded politely. "I appreciate your assistance." "Madam." He tipped his hat slightly, his voice rusty from disuse. Miller cleared his throat. "Patience is a teacher. Came all the way from Boston to educate the children in Rimrock." "I've been teaching in Denver for the past 2 years," she corrected gently. "But yes, originally from Massachusetts." Gideon said nothing. Her background made no difference to him. His job was to get her safely to Rimrock, nothing more. "We should leave soon," he said finally. "Want to make Ridge Creek by nightfall." "I'll need a few minutes to gather my things," she replied. While she retrieved her trunk and said her goodbyes to her uncle, Gideon procured a sturdy mare from the livery for her to ride. The stagecoach to Rimrock wouldn't depart for another 3 days, and the Silas gang wouldn't wait that long if they knew a lone woman was traveling with valuables. Within the hour, they were riding east out of Silver Creek. Gideon led the way, with Patience following close behind on her borrowed horse. He'd been surprised to find she rode well, sitting straight in the saddle rather than side saddle as he'd expected from an Eastern lady. They rode in silence for the first few miles, the only sounds the steady clip-clop of hooves and the creak of leather. Gideon preferred it that way. Conversation was never his strong suit. Even before the war had broken something vital inside him. "Have you been to Rimrock before, Mr. Tanner?" Her voice, when it finally came, startled him from his vigilance of the trail ahead. "Once," he answered without turning. "Mining town. Rough place. And now they want a schoolteacher," she said with a hint of amusement. "Progress, I suppose." Gideon grunted noncommittally. The trail narrowed as it began to climb into the foothills, and he focused on the terrain. The area was known for ambushes. Rocky outcroppings provided perfect cover for bandits. "Sheriff Miller, my uncle by marriage, says you're quite handy with that revolver," she continued, apparently undeterred by his lack of response. "It's a tool," he said flatly. "Like any other." "Is that all it is to you?" He glanced back at her, finding her studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Yes." She fell silent after that, but he could feel her gaze on his back as they rode. Most people avoided looking at him directly for too long. His reputation preceded him in most towns, and those who didn't know his name could read the danger in the set of his shoulders and the weathered lines of his face. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Ridge Creek came into view little more than a way station with a small inn, stable, and trading post. Gideon led them down the slope toward the buildings. "We'll stay here tonight," he said as they dismounted in front of the inn. "Leave at first light tomorrow." Patience nodded, stretching discreetly after the long ride. "Thank you for your guidance today, Mr. Tanner." He merely nodded, taking the reins of her horse along with his own and heading toward the stable. By the time he'd arranged lodging for their mounts and retrieved her small traveling bag from the saddle, she was already inside the inn, speaking with the proprietor's wife, a round-faced woman with graying hair. "Just the 2 rooms for tonight, Mrs. Hollister?" Patience was saying. "Of course, dear. Not many travelers this time of year, so you've got your pick." The older woman glanced at Gideon as he entered, her expression growing wary. "Evening, mister." He tipped his hat. "Madam." Patience turned to him. "Mrs. Hollister says there's a hot meal available if we'd like to eat before retiring." "Fine," he replied, setting her bag down near her feet. The dining room was empty save for an old man nursing a cup of coffee in the corner. They sat at a table near the window, and soon Mrs. Hollister brought out bowls of hearty stew with thick slices of bread. Gideon ate methodically, keeping his back to the wall and his attention on the door habits ingrained from years of watching for trouble. "You don't say much, do you, Mr. Tanner?" Patience asked after several minutes of silence. He looked up from his meal. "No, madam." "May I ask why?" "Nothing worth saying." She studied him for a moment. "I find that hard to believe. Everyone has something to say if given the chance." Gideon set down his spoon. Not everyone. To his surprise, she smiled. Well, I suppose I should be grateful. My last escort on the stagecoach talked incessantly about his mining investments until I was ready to throw myself from the coach. The corner of his mouth twitched involuntarily. It wasn't quite a smile, he wasn't sure he remembered how, but it was something. He quickly composed his features again. Where did you serve? She asked quietly. He stiffened. What makes you think I served? The way you carry yourself. My father was with the 20th Massachusetts. I recognized the bearing. Gideon hesitated before answering. 8th Texas Cavalry. He waited for the judgment, the change in her expression that always came when Northerners learned he'd fought for the Confederacy. But her face remained open, interested. That must have been difficult, she said simply. War's always difficult. I meant afterward. Coming home. Gideon looked away. Didn't have a home to go back to. I'm sorry. Her voice held genuine compassion, not pity. He stood abruptly. We leave at dawn. Best get some rest. Without waiting for a response, he strode from the dining room and out onto the porch. The night air was crisp, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply as he scanned the surroundings. Why had he told her about the war? He never spoke of it, not to anyone. Something about her direct gaze, perhaps, or the lack of fear in her manner. Whatever it was, it unsettled him. The door opened behind him, and Patience stepped out, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. I apologize if I overstepped, she said quietly. It wasn't my intention to pry. Gideon didn't turn. No need to apologize. My father never spoke of the war either, she continued, moving to stand beside him at the railing. Not until the very end, when he was dying. Then he couldn't stop talking about it, the men he'd lost, the things he'd seen. Gideon remained silent, watching the smoke from his cigarette drift upward. He said the hardest part wasn't the fighting, she said. It was learning to live with the memories afterward. Your father was a wise man. He was. She gazed out at the darkened landscape. He also said that carrying the burden alone only makes it heavier. Gideon extinguished his cigarette against the railing. Some burdens can't be shared, Miss Aldridge. Perhaps. But I've found that most can, if one is willing. She turned to face him. Good night, Mr. Tanner. Thank you again for your protection today. As she disappeared back inside, Gideon remained on the porch, her words echoing in his mind. Sharing burdens. The concept seemed foreign to him after so many years of solitude. He'd forgotten how to connect with others, if he'd ever truly known. Dawn arrived with a blanket of fog that shrouded the surrounding hills. They departed Ridge Creek as planned, riding in silence through the misty landscape. The trail narrowed as it wound through a forested area, forcing them to ride single file. How much further to Rimrock? Patience asked as they emerged into a small clearing. If we keep this pace, we'll be there by sunset tomorrow, Gideon replied. He reined in his horse, scanning the ridge line above them. Something didn't feel right. Is something wrong? She'd noticed his alertness, her own posture straightening in response. Not sure. He dismounted, leading his horse to a cluster of boulders. Stay here. Keep your voice down. Drawing his rifle from its scabbard, he moved quietly toward the edge of the clearing, his experienced eyes searching the terrain. The fog made visibility poor, but there was movement on the ridge, shapes moving against the gray backdrop that might be men. He made his way back to where Patience waited with the horses. We may have company, he said quietly. Silas gang, most likely. Her eyes widened, but she remained calm. What do? We can try to outrun them, but the trail ahead narrows into a canyon. Perfect spot for an ambush. And going back. He shook his head. They're between us and Ridge Creek now. Patience considered this. What would you do if you were alone? The question surprised him. Most clients simply expected him to have all the answers. There's a hunter's cabin about 2 miles north of here, off the main trail. Might be able to wait them out there. She nodded decisively. Then that's what we'll do. They mounted up and Gideon led them into the dense forest, away from the trail. The going was slow, having to navigate around fallen trees and rocky outcroppings, but the thick undergrowth provided cover from prying eyes. Twice, Gideon heard distant hoofbeats, but they faded without drawing closer. By mid-afternoon, they reached the cabin, a crude, one-room structure of rough-hewn logs that had seen better days. Gideon dismounted and approached cautiously, gun drawn, But the cabin was empty save for a few rusting traps and a broken chair. "It's not much," he said as Patience joined him at the doorway. "It has walls and a roof," she replied pragmatically. "That's enough." They brought their gear inside, and Gideon led the horses to a small lean-to behind the cabin where they'd be hidden from the trail. Inside, Patience was clearing debris from the dirt floor, her sleeves rolled up as she worked. "We should avoid making a fire," he said. "Smoke would give away our position." She nodded. "I have some bread and cheese from Mrs. Hollister. It's not warm, but it will sustain us." As dusk approached, they shared the simple meal in silence. The cabin had one small window, shuttered against the growing chill, and Gideon positioned himself where he could keep watch through a crack in the boards. "How long will we need to stay?" Patience asked, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "They usually don't linger more than a day or two," he replied. "Once they realize we've left the trail, they might give up. Or they might not." "I see." She was quiet for a moment. "Have you encountered them before?" "The Silas gang." Gideon nodded. "Twice. Small-time outlaws, mostly, but desperate and mean with it. Their leader, Silas Deacon, has a particular hatred for lawmen and anyone associated with them. Like a sheriff's niece," she said with understanding. "If they knew who you were, yes." Night fell, bringing with it a deeper cold that seeped through the cabin's walls. Gideon offered Patience his bedroll, which she initially refused, but eventually accepted when he insisted he would take the first watch anyway. She settled down near the far wall, using her folded cloak as a pillow. "Wake me when it's my turn to watch," she said. Gideon had no intention of doing so, but he nodded anyway. As she drifted off to sleep, he maintained his vigil by the window, listening to the night sounds of the forest. An owl hooted somewhere nearby, and the wind whispered through the pine branches. He found himself watching Patience as she slept, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing oddly comforting in the darkness. She was unlike any woman he'd encountered in his years of drifting. There was a quiet strength to her, an intelligence in her eyes that saw more than she let on. Sometime after midnight, he heard a sound that didn't belong, the soft nicker of a horse that wasn't theirs. Moving silently to the door, he peered through a crack between the logs. In the pale moonlight, he could make out shadowy figures moving among the trees, at least 3 of them, advancing cautiously toward the cabin. Returning to where Patience slept, he gently placed a hand over her mouth. Her eyes flew open, wide with alarm until recognition dawned. "Riders," he whispered, removing his hand. "At least 3. They found us." She sat up quickly, fear evident in her face, but her voice steady when she whispered, "What do we do?" "I'm going out there. You stay hidden." He handed her his spare revolver. "Use this if you have to." Her fingers closed around the weapon. "Be careful." Gideon slipped out the back of the cabin, circling wide through the trees until he was behind the approaching riders. 3 men, as he'd thought, moving on foot and leading their horses. They were being cautious, which told him they weren't sure if they'd found their quarry yet. From his position, he could hear fragments of their conversation. "Might not even be them, Silas," one of the men was saying. "Tracks led this way." Another voice replied, deeper, more authoritative. "And that cabin ain't been used in years. Suddenly there's horses hidden out back. Could be trappers. In October? Don't be stupid. It's them." Gideon weighed his options. He could try to pick them off one by one from the darkness, but if any of them got off a shot, it would give away his position. Better to try to drive them off. Moving to a new position, he deliberately stepped on a branch, causing it to snap loudly. The men froze, guns drawn. "What was that?" one of them hissed. "Probably a deer," said the one called Silas, though he didn't sound convinced. Gideon moved again, to their right this time, making enough noise to be heard, but staying hidden in the shadows. The men were growing nervous, pointing their weapons toward every sound. "Spread out," Silas ordered. "Find whatever's out there." This was what Gideon had been waiting for. As the men separated, he circled around to where their horses were tethered. Drawing his knife, he slashed the saddlebags open, finding what he expected, stolen valuables from previous robberies. He took a small pouch of coins and a silver pocket watch, then untied the horses and gave each a sharp slap on the rump. The animals bolted, crashing through the underbrush and sending the outlaws into a panic. "The horses," one of them shouted. "Shoot." Silas commanded. Someone's out there. Gunfire erupted, wild shots in the darkness that had no hope of finding their target. Gideon used the distraction to circle back toward the cabin, staying low and moving quickly. "It's a trap," he heard one of the men yell. "Let's get out of here." More gunshots followed, but they were retreating now, shouting to each other as they tried to locate their scattered horses in the darkness. Gideon waited until the sounds of their pursuit faded before returning to the cabin. He found Patience standing just inside the door, his revolver held steadily in both hands, aimed directly at his chest as he entered. "It's me," he said quietly. She lowered the weapon with a shaky breath. "I heard gunshots. They're gone for now. Lost their horses." He moved to the window, peering out into the moonlit clearing. "We should move, though. They'll be back once they regroup. Now, in the dark, moon's bright enough. They won't expect us to travel at night." He began gathering their few belongings. "There's an old mining camp about 10 miles west of here. We can reach it by dawn if we push hard." Patience nodded, rolling up his bedroll with efficient movements. "I'm ready when you are." Within minutes, they were mounted and moving through the forest, Gideon leading the way through the darkness. The moon provided just enough light to avoid the worst obstacles, but it was slow going. "You handled yourself well back there," he said after they'd ridden for an hour in silence. She glanced at him, surprise evident in her expression at the unexpected compliment. "I was terrified. Didn't show it. My father always said courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done despite the fear." Gideon nodded. Another wise saying from the man who had raised this remarkable woman. "Your father taught you well." He tried. There was a sadness in her voice that made him glance back at her. "He came back from the war. Different. Distant. For years, he barely spoke to anyone, even my mother and me." The words struck a chord in Gideon. How many people had he pushed away over the years? How many connections had he severed because he couldn't bear to feel anything? "What changed?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "Time. Patience, my namesake," she said with a small smile. And eventually, he realized that shutting everyone out wasn't protecting him from pain, it was keeping him from healing. They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. The forest gradually thinned as they descended into a narrow valley, following what had once been a mining road, but was now little more than a game trail. As the first light of dawn crept over the eastern mountains, they came upon the abandoned mining camp, a collection of dilapidated wooden structures clustered around the entrance to a played-out silver mine. Gideon led them to what had once been the foreman's cabin, its roof still mostly intact. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he said, helping Patience dismount, "then continue on to Rimrock. We can reach it by nightfall if the weather holds." Inside, the cabin was dusty but offered shelter from the elements. Gideon cleared a space in the corner while Patience tended to the horses, watering them from a nearby stream. "You should sleep," he told her when she returned. "I'll keep watch." She shook her head. "You haven't slept at all. It's my turn." He started to protest, but the determination in her eyes stopped him. "Wake me at the first sign of trouble." "I will." Gideon stretched out on the hard wooden floor, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He didn't expect to sleep, hadn't been able to sleep deeply in years, but exhaustion overtook him more quickly than he anticipated. He dreamed of the war, as he often did. The screams of dying men, the thunderous roar of cannons, the coppery smell of blood mingling with gunpowder. But this time, there was something different. A gentle touch on his forehead, a soft voice calling his name. Gideon woke with a start, hand automatically reaching for his gun before he registered Patience kneeling beside him, her face concerned. "You were having a nightmare," she said softly. "I didn't want to startle you, but you seemed distressed." He sat up, disoriented by both the unexpected sleep and her proximity. "How long was I out?" "About 3 hours. There's been no sign of pursuit." Gideon nodded, rising to his feet and moving to the window to scan their surroundings. The mining camp remained deserted, silent in the midday sun. "We should move on," he said, turning back to her. "Still have a good distance to cover before nightfall." They gathered their belongings and set out once more, following the old mining road that eventually connected with the main trail to Rimrock. The day grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, and they rode side by side where the trail permitted. "Tell me about Rimrock." Patience said as they crossed a shallow stream. You mentioned you've been there before. Once, about 2 years ago. Silver mining town. Rough place then, but growing. The mine owner Hardwick. I think his name was wanted to attract families, so he built a church. School's probably his doing too. Creating civilization in the wilderness, she mused. It's why I came west, you know. To be part of building something new. Plenty of schools back east. She nodded. But they don't need me the way these frontier towns do. Here, education can truly change lives. Her idealism should have seemed naive to him, but instead, Gideon found it oddly refreshing. How long had it been since he'd believed in anything beyond survival? What about you, Mr. Tanner? She asked. What keeps you moving from town to town? He considered deflecting the question, as he usually did when people pried into his life. But something about her earnest interest made him answer honestly. Don't know how to stay in one place anymore. Been drifting so long, it's become a habit. Is that what you want? To drift forever? The question caught him off guard. Want? He hadn't considered what he wanted in years. Survival had been the only goal. Never thought about it, he admitted. Perhaps you should, she suggested gently. It's never too late to build a different life. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching riders drew his attention. Instinctively, he moved his horse in front of hers, hand dropping to his holster. Around the bend came a group of 4 men, well-dressed and mounted on quality horses. Not outlaws, by the look of them, but Gideon remained wary. Afternoon, called the lead rider, a gray-haired man with a thick beard. Fine day for traveling. Gideon nodded but didn't relax his posture. Heading to Rimrock. Just came from there, the man replied. On our way to Denver. Business matters. He glanced at Patience with interest. You folks heading to Rimrock, then? Yes, Patience answered before Gideon could stop her. I'm to be the new schoolteacher. The man's face brightened. Is that so? Well, they've been waiting for you eagerly, madam. Name's Edward Hardwick. I own the silver mine there. Gideon tensed at the name. The very man he'd mentioned earlier. Mr. Hardwick, Patience said with a smile. What a pleasant coincidence. I'm Patience Aldridge. Miss Aldridge, it's an honor. The town's been without a proper teacher for nearly a year. Hardwick glanced at Gideon, his expression turning more guarded. And your companion is? Gideon Tanner, she replied. My escort from Silver Creek. Recognition flickered in Hardwick's eyes. Tanner, I've heard of you. Most have, Gideon said flatly. An uncomfortable silence fell until Hardwick cleared his throat. Well, the road ahead is clear all the way to Rimrock. You should make it by sunset if you keep a steady pace. Thank you for the information, Patience said politely. The two groups parted ways, continuing in opposite directions. Once they were out of earshot, Patience turned to Gideon. He seemed to know you. My reputation travels. His tone made it clear he didn't want to elaborate. They rode in silence for several miles, the terrain gradually changing as they approached Rimrock. The narrow trail widened into a proper road, and signs of habitation became more frequent: fenced pastures, the occasional farmhouse, wagon tracks in the dust. By late afternoon, they crested a rise that offered their first view of Rimrock, nestled in the valley below a substantial settlement with several streets of buildings, a church steeple rising prominently in the center. Patience reined in her horse, gazing down at her new home. It's larger than I expected. Silver's been good to them, Gideon observed. Town's probably doubled in size since I was last here. They descended into the valley as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the road. The first buildings they passed were the usual assortment of businesses found in any mining town: assay office, general store, saloon. But there were also signs of permanence and prosperity: a brick bank building, a 2-story hotel, neat houses with small gardens. People on the boardwalk stopped to watch them pass, curious about the newcomers. Gideon felt the familiar weight of their stares, the whispers that followed in his wake. Beside him, Patience sat straight in her saddle, offering polite nods to those they passed. They stopped in front of the hotel, a respectable-looking establishment called the Silver Palace. Gideon dismounted first, then helped Patience down from her horse. I'll see you settled, then be on my way, he said, his voice neutral despite the strange reluctance he felt at the thought of leaving. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Where will you go? He shrugged. North, maybe. Haven't decided. Before she could respond, A portly man in a suit hurried down the hotel steps toward them. "Miss Aldridge? Is that you?" he called. "I'm Mayor Wilson. We've been expecting you." Patience turned to greet him with a smile. "Mayor Wilson? Yes, I'm Patience Aldridge." "Wonderful, wonderful. We're so pleased you've arrived safely." The mayor pumped her hand enthusiastically, then glanced at Gideon. His smile faltered. "And you are?" "This is Mr. Tanner," Patience said. "He escorted me from Silver Creek." The mayor's expression turned wary. "Tanner? Not Gideon Tanner." Gideon met his gaze steadily. "The same." Wilson cleared his throat nervously. "Well, appreciate you delivering our teacher safely, Mr. Tanner. You'll be continuing on your way, I presume?" Before Gideon could answer, Patience spoke up. "Actually, Mr. Tanner has been traveling for days on my behalf. I'm sure he could use a proper meal and rest before departing." The mayor looked uncomfortable but nodded. Of course. The hotel has vacancies, and the dining room serves excellent meals." "Thank you, Mayor," Patience said. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we're both quite tired from the journey." The mayor tipped his hat and retreated, throwing one last uncertain glance at Gideon before hurrying away. Patience turned to face Gideon, a determined look in her eyes. "You don't have to leave tonight," she said quietly. "At least stay for a proper meal and a night's rest." Gideon hesitated. The logical choice was to move on. He had no place in a town like Rimrock, no future here. And yet, the thought of saying goodbye to Patience Aldridge filled him with a hollow feeling he couldn't quite name. One night, he conceded. They secured rooms at the hotel and stabled their horses. After washing away the dust of travel, they met in the hotel's dining room for supper. It was a cozy space with white tablecloths and oil lamps casting a warm glow over the dozen or so tables. Several other diners glanced their way as they were seated, curious whispers following in their wake. "You're causing quite a stir," Patience observed with a small smile. "The new schoolteacher dining with the notorious Gideon Tanner. Not good for your reputation," he said bluntly. She waved a dismissive hand. "I've never been overly concerned with others' opinions. Besides, you saved my life. They can gossip all they want." Their meal arrived: roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread that put the trail rations to shame. As they ate, Patience spoke of her plans for the school, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. Gideon found himself listening intently, drawn in by her passion. "You'll make a good teacher," he said when she paused for breath. "These children are fortunate." Her cheeks colored slightly at the compliment. "Thank you. That means a great deal coming from you." "From me? Why?" "Because you don't offer praise lightly, I think." She studied him across the table. "Your good opinion has value precisely because it's so rarely given." Gideon wasn't sure how to respond to that. He'd never thought of himself as someone whose opinion might matter to others, especially someone like her. As they finished their meal, a commotion at the hotel entrance drew their attention. Through the dining room doorway, they could see several men entering the lobby, their voices raised in anger. Among them was the unmistakable figure of Silas Deacon. Gideon was on his feet instantly. "Stay here," he told Patience, his hand already on his revolver as he moved toward the door. In the lobby, Silas was arguing with the hotel clerk. "I know they're here. We tracked them all the way from Ridge Creek." "Sir, please lower your voice," the clerk was saying. "This is a respectable establishment." Silas slammed his fist on the counter. "I don't care how respectable you think you are. That man stole from us, and we want what's ours." Gideon stepped into the lobby, his presence immediately drawing the attention of the four outlaws. "Looking for me, Silas?" The outlaw's hand dropped to his gun. "Tanner, should have known it was you playing games in the forest. Where's our property?" "You mean the stolen goods you were carrying?" Gideon's voice was calm, but his posture was battle-ready. "Handed them over to the sheriff in Silver Creek before we left." It was a lie, but a useful one. The items he'd taken were still in his saddlebag, but claiming they were already in law enforcement's possession might defuse the situation. Silas's face contorted with rage. "You're lying. Check with Sheriff Miller if you don't believe me. Though he might have some questions for you about those stagecoach robberies." The hotel clerk had slipped away, presumably to find the local law. The other patrons were backing toward the walls, sensing the imminent danger. "You cost us those horses too," Silas growled. 2 days it took us to round them up." "Should have taken the hint and moved on," Gideon replied. Silas's eyes narrowed. Where's the woman? The schoolteacher? She's coming with us collateral until we get our property back. No, she isn't. Gideon's voice hardened to steel. You willing to die for her, Tanner? They say you're fast, but there's 4 of us. Before Gideon could respond, the hotel doors burst open and 3 men entered, led by a tall figure wearing a sheriff's badge. What's all this commotion? The lawman demanded. Silas turned, his hand still hovering near his weapon. Sheriff, just a misunderstanding with an old acquaintance. The sheriff's gaze shifted between Silas and Gideon, recognition dawning in his eyes. Silas Deacon and Gideon Tanner, 2 men I never expected to see in my town at once. He hooked his thumbs in his belt. Anyone want to tell me what's really going on here? These men have been tracking us from Silver Creek, came Patience's voice as she emerged from the dining room. They attempted to rob us along the trail. Silas glared at her. That's a lie. This man stole from us. After you tried to ambush us, Gideon countered. The sheriff raised a hand for silence. Miss, you must be the new schoolteacher. Mayor Wilson mentioned you'd arrived. Patience nodded. Patience Aldridge, yes. And you say these men tried to rob you? They surrounded the cabin where we took shelter last night. Mr. Tanner drove them off. The sheriff studied Silas and his men with a hard gaze. Deacon, you and your boys are wanted in 3 counties. Been getting reports of stage robberies matching your methods for months. He drew his revolver. I think you'd better come along to the jail while we sort this out. For a tense moment, it seemed Silas might resist. His hand twitched toward his holster, and Gideon tensed, ready to draw. But something in the outlaw's expression shifted, a calculation made and decision reached. Another time, Tanner, Silas said quietly before raising his hands. We're coming peaceful, Sheriff. No need for bloodshed. As the sheriff and his deputies led the outlaws away, Gideon felt the tension drain from his body. Beside him, Patience released a shaky breath. Are you all right? He asked. She nodded. Thanks to you. Again, the hotel lobby gradually returned to normal as the excitement subsided. Gideon and Patience retreated to a quiet corner near the fireplace, away from curious ears. You should have stayed in the dining room, he told her. Silas is unpredictable, dangerous. I couldn't just hide while you faced them alone, she replied. Not after everything we've been through. Her loyalty touched something in him that he'd thought long dead. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the flames dance in the hearth. What will you do now? She finally asked. Still planning to leave in the morning? The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Gideon had been drifting for so long, never staying anywhere long enough to form connections. The thought of continuing that existence suddenly seemed unbearably empty. Hadn't decided, he said slowly. Patience turned to face him, her expression earnest. Rimrock needs good men, Mr. Tanner. Men who can stand against the Silas Deacons of the world. I'm not a lawman. No, but you have skills this growing town could use. She hesitated. And I would be glad if you stayed. The simple admission stirred something in his chest, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Why would you want that? You barely know me. I know enough, she said softly. I know you're a man of honor, despite what others might say about you. I know you risked your life to protect me, a stranger. And I know there's more to you than the cold exterior you show the world. Gideon looked away, uncomfortable with her perception. People here know my reputation. They won't want me staying. Then give them a reason to change their minds. Her hand covered his on the armrest, the touch sending an unexpected jolt through him. Everyone deserves a second chance, Gideon. Even you. The use of his first name, spoken so gently, broke something loose inside him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt the stirring of hope, fragile and tentative, but unmistakably real. The next morning, Gideon rose early and walked to the sheriff's office. The lawman, Sheriff Thomas Burke, was surprised to see him. Tanner, thought you'd be riding out with the dawn. Got a proposition for you, Gideon said without preamble. Town's growing. Must need additional law enforcement. Burke leaned back in his chair, studying him with interest. You offering your services? On a trial basis. See if it works out. The sheriff stroked his mustache thoughtfully. Your reputation precedes you. Some folks might be uncomfortable. Understand that. But I kept your schoolteacher safe when others couldn't. Burke nodded slowly. That you did. And having someone with your experience might discourage troublemakers. He extended his hand. Let's give it a month. See how it goes. Gideon shook the offered hand, sealing the agreement. It wasn't a permanent commitment, but it was a chance to be something more than a drifter with a deadly reputation. When he told Patience the news later that morning, her face lit up with a smile that made his heart stutter in his chest. I knew you'd stay, she said, her voice warm with approval. Only for a month. Trial basis. A month can change everything, she replied. She was right. In the weeks that followed, Gideon found himself gradually becoming part of Rimrock's community. His presence as a deputy sheriff initially caused whispers and sidelong glances, but as he helped resolve disputes, prevented bar fights, and ran off would-be troublemakers, the townsfolk began to accept him. He visited Patience at the schoolhouse regularly, first with the excuse of checking security, then simply because he enjoyed her company. They took to walking together in the evenings, her animated conversation drawing him out of his shell bit by bit. It was during one such walk, a month after his arrival in Rimrock, that Patience asked the question he'd been avoiding. The war changed you, didn't it? That's why people say you're broken inside. They had stopped at the edge of town, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Gideon was silent for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. Lost my brother at Shiloh, he finally said, his voice rough with emotion long suppressed. Held him while he died. After that, something in me shut down. Couldn't bear to feel anything. Was easier that way. Patience moved closer, her arm brushing against his. And now, he turned to look at her. Really look at her gentle eyes. The way the setting sun brought out the auburn highlights in her hair, the compassion in her expression. Now I'm not so sure, he admitted. Being around you. It makes me remember what it was like. To care. To feel. Is that a good thing? She asked softly. Terrifying, he said honestly. But yes, I think it might be. She smiled then, reaching out to take his hand in hers. I'm glad. The simple touch sent warmth spreading through him, as if a frozen river inside was finally beginning to thaw. Before he could think better of it, Gideon raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Patience's breath caught, her eyes widening slightly. Then, with deliberate slowness, she stepped closer and rested her palm against his cheek. The tenderness of the gesture undid him completely. When he drew her into his arms, it felt like coming home after years of wandering. And as he held her against his chest, Gideon Tanner, the man they said was too broken to feel, trembled with the force of emotions he could no longer deny. In that moment, under the vast Colorado sky, he knew he had found where he belonged. Not just in Rimrock, but with her, this remarkable woman who had seen past his scars and believed there was still something worth saving. Stay, she whispered against his chest. Not just for a month. Stay for good. And for the first time in 15 years, Gideon smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and warmed his soul. Yes, he said simply. I'll stay. In the months and years that followed, the townsfolk of Rimrock would remark on the transformation of the feared gunslinger who had become their most respected deputy. They would note how the schoolteacher's love had changed him, how his cold eyes had warmed, how he'd found his voice again. But Gideon knew the truth was both simpler and more profound. Patience hadn't fixed him, she had simply shown him that being broken didn't mean being beyond redemption. That feeling pain also meant being able to feel joy. That love, above all, was worth the risk. And when they married the following spring, with the whole town in attendance, no one who saw him trembling as he spoke his vows would ever again say that Gideon Tanner was too broken to feel.